It's The Weekly Show with David J. Maloney. This week, David talks to Little Feat guitarist Scott Sherrod. And now, here's your host, David J. Maloney.
Welcome to everyone at home, and I would normally say our studio audience to The Weekly Show. I'm your host, David J. Maloney. I say normally because before the pandemic, we'd shoot the show before a small studio audience at the Hard Rock Hotel and Casino, but we've since been relegated to shooting it from home due to coronavirus concerns. We had hoped to get back to our live-to-tape shows, but recently learned we are now not being renewed for that format. Instead, we're going to be taking a few-week hiatus and airing a few of our past favorite shows before returning with a televised podcast format. This will allow us to continue having so many great guests, most of whom can only join us via video call. You're still going to be able to view the show on television right here on the Gulf Coast, as well as on YouTube, but you're also going to be able to listen to extended versions of our guest interviews on our new very own Weekly Show podcast. So please look to our social media in the next few weeks for updates on how you're going to be able to stream our program. So, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson is under investigation for throwing parties during his country's lockdown. And sadly, Johnson's having another bad hair day. For his last meal, Oklahoma death row convict Donald Grant ate sesame chicken, 6 egg rolls, shrimp fried rice, a large apple fritter, and 3 pints of strawberry ice cream. Oklahoma's death house is famous for its sesame chicken. It's so good, prisoners say it's to die for. In his latest song, Kanye West raps, "God saved me from the crash, just so I can beat Pete Davidson's ass." Love Kanye or hate him, you gotta admit, he's certainly a gifted poet. Speaking of Kim Kardashian, her publicist has recently denied the existence of a second Ray J sex tape. Her original tape was released in 2007, and to this day, it's the only known footage of Kim displaying any talent. Lastly, according to Reptiles magazine, a gecko can hang by just one toe. But contrary to popular belief, it can't save you money on car insurance. On tonight's show, we've got a wonderfully talented singer-songwriter and musician who spent years as a musical director of the Gregg Allman Band and who tours as a full member of the acclaimed and accomplished rock band Little Feat. Here to talk about stories from his career, Gregg Allman, and Little Feat is guitarist Scott Sherrod. So don't go anywhere, we'll be right back.
Our featured guest tonight has been in and around rock and Americana royalty for most of his life, and by many is considered royalty himself. For his solo projects, to his songwriting and his involvement with some of the most spectacular bands and musicians of American music, including the Gregg Allman Band and Little Feat, he has been acclaimed for his skill as both a musician and his sensibilities as an artist. Little Feat will be playing the Saenger Theater in Mobile on March 23rd. Here to talk about his incredible story, his current adventure with Little Feat, their upcoming shows, and many memories in between is the legendary Scott Sherrod. Scott, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that introduction.
Well, I'd like to get to know a little bit more about your story before we get into the kind of the meat of the interview. Where did you grow up and what was life like for you there?
Well, I mean, my recent solo album was called Rust Belt because people ask me where I'm from, and I basically just say the Rust Belt. I'm not trying to be cheeky. I was born in Ann Arbor, Michigan. I was raised in Dearborn, and then my family moved all over the Midwest, essentially, which included a brief stint in Minnesota, a longer formative few years in Newtown, Pennsylvania, which is right on the edge of the Rust Belt, and then went back for high school, sophomore year of high school, went back and went to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And then in 1996, I made the move to, coming right out of high school, I made the move to New York City, and I've been here ever since.
I know your dad had a seemingly massive impact on your life path, given he was a musician himself. What did he play, and what would you say was his biggest influence?
Well, he's a guitarist and singer, and, Rock and Roll Freud would have a field day with my life. The brief version of it is, my father was a singer-songwriter who started with garage rock bands in Michigan in the 60s, and then saw Bob Dylan at Michigan State University play solo, doing Blowin' in the Wind, and decided to sell all his electric instruments and go acoustic. And then he became a folk blues troubadour, essentially. He did the whole path of going to LA and tried to get signed, and the long story short is none of it worked out. And eventually they had me in 1976 in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And, basically my dad, especially after they had me, settled into going into first college radio and then eventually cable television, and would support his music habit with his work instead of the other way around. But I grew up going to tons of concerts, and I was in a very artistic leaning family. A lot of books, a lot of plays, a lot of movies, and a lot of really deep music, including a lot of very deep blues and soul and jazz. And then I would say, I've always said the Beatles and Rolling Stones of my household were really Little Feat and the Allman Brothers, which is, it's quite insane when you think about the fact that those were the bands who I went to see when I was a kid to experience rock and roll for the first time, and they were the favorite bands of my parents, and I've ended up in these sort of iterations or extended families of both of them.
Yeah, that's just way cool when you have those things and then they just kind of fall into place, and like, who would have thought, if you had a time machine, So I've heard that some of your high school for the arts classmates went on to some fantastic careers as well. Who all comes to mind there?
So we had all these amazing musicians who came through the program, like McCoy Tyner and Roy Hargrove, Tito Puente, Jerry Mulligan. And the students at the school all had to audition to get in, and it was very strict, even though it was a public school. It was a very intense program. And my classmates, Sean Hinton, who was a year my junior, he went on to become Mary J. Blige's MD, and he's written a number of popular songs, and he's a phenomenal musician. My friend Katie Foffel, who is a phenomenal singer, she was in Warhorse, Steven Spielberg's production at Lincoln Center, and now she's runs these amazing Broadway vocal instruction and charity operations. My classmate Sean Dixon, who was a year ahead of me, we went on to form a group called the Chesterfields. That was my first band. We came to New York together. Sean since then has worked with a number of great artists like Michelle Ndegeocello and a bunch of great New York-based poets and hip-hop artists. So it's a pretty diverse bunch, but everybody went on to either be a professional musician or a music educator in my class and in the classes behind and ahead of me.
So how did the band, your band, the Chesterfields, come about, and what made you guys decide to jump to New York?
This is something that occurred to me recently, and I'm glad you asked me because it brought this up, the opportunity to talk about this when I was 15. I got fired from this band, the Blues Disciples, because I wasn't an authentic enough blues performer. And the reason I was fired was because I wanted to play Little Feat and Allman Brothers songs. But the irony is when they fired me, I took the two best guys in the band, the drummer and the B3 organ player. This is the early 90s in Milwaukee. I took them with me. And they, as I said, they're both older guys. And we formed a group called the Chesterfield Kings with a bassist named Rick Holmes. So this was like the other laboratory I had besides the school was this nighttime one where I was with all these older cats, and luckily Mike Costel, the owner of the bar, at 16 I was legally allowed to be an employee there, so he signed me on as a barback. But that got me the green light to go in there anytime I wanted to sit in, to play gigs. And it was on the east side of Milwaukee, 15-20 minute walk from my parents' house.
It's interesting that you kind of stepped into the music business in New York also at the time that you did, because that was, as I recall, that was kind of when the industry was sort of starting to flip on its head a little bit. What are the lessons you learned from those early years in New York and kind of having a front row seat to seeing the industry start to go through some of those changes?
I had some meetings with people like Ahmet Ertegun and Russ Titleman when I first got to town who, when I was 21, they were recognizing my talent. And, Ahmet's the guy who started Atlantic Records. He's arguably the most important record man in history. Being that he had Atlantic and subsidiary being Stax Records and worked with Jerry Wexler and did all the Aretha Franklin, Allman Brothers, Led Zeppelin, Rolling Stones. It's just John Coltrane, Ornette Coleman. It's like Ray Charles, is how he started. So he gave me some great advice in 2000 when I met with him, or 99, it might have been 99 or 2000. he basically told me, he's like, the whole thing is over. The tastemakers are out. They're suing kids for downloading. Get good at everything. That was his advice to me. And where that's gone is, yes, I had a front row seat, as you said, for the complete decimation of the record business, we'll say. And then I saw the rise of the live music business. And in the live music business, I watched agents and promoters who, with the very rare exceptions, like, let's say, Bill Graham back in the 60s. Every once in a while you get a Bill Graham, but most of these people are like car salesmen. They're not tastemakers. And when live music and rock and roll and roots music superseded the profit margins of the records, people who had no business being tastemakers became them.
And when you refer to tastemakers, for those that don't know, what exactly who are you calling the tastemakers, and what role did they play in the industry?
What I call sort of the beginning of our rock and roll American roots music renaissance, where the jazz and the blues and the folk and the Appalachian and all the stuff started to merge. And that's where you have, it starts with Sam Phillips at Sun Records, Berry Gordy at Motown, Stax Records in Memphis, and you have the Seahorn Soul Farm in New Orleans, those early Little Richard records, Chuck Berry in St. Louis, so and Chess Records, of course, in Chicago. So those were all these family businesses that then got absorbed by conglomerates. Those people, Leonard and Phil Chess, Sam Phillips, Berry Gordy, Marshall Seahorn, these guys were the first tastemakers in record making. And by that I mean these are guys who discovered local talent. They shined their local talent in the best light they possibly could, but they kept the realness, the rawness, the creativity. They geared everything towards the art. So when people talk about American music, I talk about the American musical renaissance built around records, which goes from like the 50s till the 80s. And it extends into the 80s, because even in the 80s you had Prince was given full creative control. I mean, there were these unprecedented things happening to us now where it's like, here's a 5-album deal to an unknown artist. Make whatever you like and let's see what happens.
I've still got family in New York, as I grew up a little upstate in Woodstock, in fact, Bearsville, right up the street from Bearsville.
Oh, great.
And I heard through the grapevine that the show you put on, Scott Sherrard and Friends Celebrate the Life of Duane Allman and the Muscle Shoals Sound, was like one of the best shows ever, like, period. Can you walk us through putting that show together and how that came about?
I came up with the idea of doing Muscle Shoals Sound because, Duane Allman started his career as a guitarist in the studio with this incredible array of amazing artists like Johnny Jenkins and Aretha Franklin, and then eventually like Herbie Mann, Boz Scaggs. And then, of course, the early Allman Brothers rehearsals were done at Muscle Shoals. So the first, I think it was the Hourglass or the Almond Joys, I can't remember which one, did their first demos with Rick Hall at Muscle Shoals. That Muscle Shoals sound that ended up resulting in a band like the Allman Brothers has to do with knocking down all these walls of like genre and to a certain extent culture and race and all the things that divide us. And I think that's why the show resonated, is it kind of pulled together a lot of different threads of American roots music history. And then we had this amazing house band, and the guests were just, it was unbelievable. We had everyone from Dwayne Betts, Dickie's son, who's a phenomenal guitar player, to Tash Neal, and we had Vernon Reid and Robert Randolph, Vannice Thomas, the daughter of Rufus Thomas, who's just an amazing vocalist, Lisa Fisher, who's like an otherworldly talent. It was just, it was like all the best people you could ever imagine were there to do it.
Did Greg ever talk about his brother Duane otherwise? I mean, did his life and death have continued significance to him in a way that he would talk about it? Or was it one of those things he kept very private like a lot of us do?
He kept a lot of things very private. And Greg would choose who he would bring all the way in. And I don't know why this is the case, but people have always felt very comfortable talking to me. I think that's why I feel a lot of comfort as a music educator as well. I really try to listen and I try to take time to understand where someone else is coming from. And when I joined Greg's band, he really started to gravitate towards me on the first tour. I'll never forget. I think we were going to play like our fourth gig, January 2009. We were playing multiple nights at the Ram's Head in Annapolis, and we were in that gym at the Lowe's down the street. I was running on the treadmill, and he came in. And, at this point, I'm like the new guy in the band, and I was nervous, And he comes in, and he starts talking to me. So I stopped on the treadmill, and we sat down, I'll never forget, on these two treadmills, and we talked for an hour, and he told me all these stories about Duane and how hard it was to lose him and how hard it was to go on with life after losing him and how hard it is to play music and think about him. And it was just this really like beautiful moment we had. And it was kind of like so early in my tenure that it didn't occur to me till years later when, he asked me to be the music director and we started writing songs. I started to understand, this started on that day sitting on the treadmills when we should have been working out. Instead, we were talking about how do you go on after losing the most important person in your life besides your mom,
Let's chat about Little Feat. You said before that they were equivalent to the Beatles for you growing up. They were the band for you. I believe you were fortunate enough to see them live growing up. What went through your mind the first time you ever saw a video or photo of Lowell George on stage?
Well, Lowell was, okay, so I was, I was listening to the band the whole time I was growing up on the radio and on cassette and on vinyl and stuff. And my dad playing their songs in the living room, me learning their songs in the living room. But Lowell was like a mystery in the 80s when I was a kid. So I saw them live for the first time when I was about 12 years old. They were on the Let It Roll tour. So this is, we had Richie was there, and we saw a few shows on that tour, a couple that specifically that I can remember, and then a couple years later after Representing the Mambo came out. And from the first time I saw them, I said, this is the band I want to be in. And when I was 10, I remember seeing a picture of Lowell George in a magazine. And I was an overweight, completely ostracized, uncomfortable child. And I was obsessed with Chuck Berry and Mad Magazine. And when I saw Lowell George and I heard Sailing Shoes album and the Waiting for Columbus album, I said, this is what I'm going to do with my life. Then I heard the Allman Brothers for the first time with a guitar in my hand, because I heard them growing up, but then I had a guitar and I would play along, and I said, oh boy. But the thing is, I would look at a picture of Greg Allman and I'd go, well, this guy's like a matinee idol. But I looked at a picture of Lowell George and I go, maybe I can do this. It was like for a fat Midwestern kid, with an intellectual bent who loved blues music, there was no greater gift than discovering Little Feat.
Was there a point during the pandemic where you thought, oh, well, this is it, I guess? You just made this massive and exciting career move, and then the whole kind of world starts changing around you and everyone else, obviously. Was there a point where that kind of concerned you, or did you always kind of feel like, okay, well, we'll just get past this and get back to doing our touring and whatever it is that Little Feat does?
Well, the break, the pandemic break, it did a number of really astonishing things for me on a personal level. My children, my boys are 10 and 4 now. And to be honest with you, between Greg and my solo career, and my wife and I have been together, well over 20 years, and I just have the most amazing wife and children you could ever ask for. And at times I have felt very undeserving of them with how much I have to be away. And quickly went from being an existential crisis to an existential revelation as a human. Then being on the phone with Bill Payne regularly, starting to unravel all the problems with Little Feat and having the time to reassess what Little Feat could be instead of what it had become. I've heard Bill refer to this chapter of the band as like the third movement, you know, with like maybe Feats Don't Fail Me Now being the first one, and then Let It Roll being the second, and this being the third. So we'll see what we can accomplish. But the pandemic, to answer your question, it gave Little Feat time to really sort out what it needed to do to grow in the absence of the brilliance of Paul Barrere. And of course, you know, we lost Richie in, what was it, 2011, and of course we lost Lowell in 1979. So the band has been through losing three geniuses. So, you know, how do they figure out how to carry on? Well, I mean, Tony and I will just keep swinging and see if we get lucky. I mean, that's all we can do. But we're going to do a Waiting for Columbus tour, and then we're going to make a new Little Feat album, and we're going to try to get this band in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. I mean, that's what we're going to try to do.
And well deserved. Now that the world is getting into its groove again, you guys are touring again and have an upcoming show right here on the Gulf Coast at the Singer Theater in Mobile on March 23rd. What can our viewers expect to see at that show?
Well, we will be playing the Waiting for Columbus album front to back, and it's not going to be a note-for-note interpretation of the album. We're going to stretch out things here and there. We're going to take some risks and chances with it. And then I think, you know, at some of these gigs, I'm not sure about Mobile, but we're going to have special guests showing up here and there on the tour to sing a song here or there. What do I think they're going to get? I think they're going to get like one of the most kick-ass rock and roll shows they can see. And then when we come back in 23, maybe they'll hear some new music.
So you mentioned some social media earlier. Where can we follow y'all on social media, as well as you individually, with regard to, you know, some of the instructional things you were telling about earlier? We can put it up on the screen for everybody right here.
Yeah, well, I mean, for Little Feat, I mean, it's, what is it, littlefeat.net? I can't remember. And then, you know, Little Feat has a Facebook and Instagram page. Those aren't hard to find. For me, I always say if you can surmount the challenge of spelling my name, I'm very easy to find. So Scott Sherrard, SHARRARD.com, and it's the same thing on Facebook and Instagram. There isn't, I'm not aware of any other Scott Sherrard musicians in the world at this point. And for the education stuff, you know, really, TrueFire has been my partner in the last few years, and I love this company, and they are just, every year they are just expanding by leaps and bounds. It's been unbelievable. I started with them pretty early on. So if you go to truefire.com and you look me up, again, if you can spell my name, you can find me. I have a few courses on there for guitar, and one of them called Southern Roots also gets into like how I produce and write songs a little bit. But most of my content on TrueFire is for the hardcore guitarists.
Scott, thank you so much for joining us. Ladies and gentlemen, Scott Sherrard.
Thanks for having me, man.
That's our show for tonight. A special thanks to Scott Sherrard for joining us, and thank you so much for watching all these years. Stay safe, everyone.